We've got a top 5 design tips for better grant figures session prepared for you all. Great. And again, regardless of whether you have a grant deadline coming up or not, hopefully some of these tips will help you make better figures in general. So you can kind of, sit back, relax, enjoy some of these tips that we've got prepared for you. Of course, the sad state of reality today is that um, uh, biology figures are kind of disjointed aesthetically, and also, uh, there are no kind of standardized software to be able to communicate. And so you're all familiar with images like this. We've shown it before. And this is kind of our endeavors to help fix this. And BioRender is a really easy to use drag and drop application. And right here, we're showing the PDB plugin, but we've got tens of thousands of icons that you can use to create your images, really removing the need to be able to draw. Some of you might be able to draw really well, but I would guess the majority of you probably find that part quite challenging. So we've eliminated that in the illustration part. Sometimes even the design part, because you've got templates and pre-made clusters of icons in some cases. And we'll go through that in more detail in the demo itself. So of course, grant applications, really good use case for BioRender, as well as really the entire kind of scientific endeavor from beginning to end, even talking to patients and the general public. I think that's even more important these days, as you may all know. So just keep that in mind. I'd love to hear your ideas of how you're using BioRender in creative ways. I think one time we've heard about, whiteboarding ideas even. So yeah, we'd love to hear how you're using BioRender today. So on today's topic, of course, it's about grant figures in particular. And again, the consideration is, generally speaking, and I use NIH grant application here just as a placeholder. Of course, there are hundreds of different grants out there, if not thousands, that you're probably looking to apply for. Usually you need to summarize a lot of information in a small amount of space. So again, we're going to go into tips on how to maximize that for your next figure. I just pulled this from the OECD website from Pitt, and basically wanted to show that this is typical. It's actually quite well summarized. And if you can get away with figures that are mostly these kind of linear, simple diagrams, not as challenging. I think the challenge really comes when you have these kind of squishy organic things and these sort of mishmash of, showing a mouse with cells and then zooming into the maybe nanoparticle level along with data sets and graphs and charts. That's when it becomes a little more challenging as far as how to lay out your diagram. And again, a little itty bitty space. If you're lucky enough and you can blow up your image to be a page large, that's even better, but that is also no excuse to kind of throw in everything under the sun as well. You don't want to overwhelm your reviewer. So let's dive into the kind of 5 tips for better grant figures with all that said in mind. And as with every webinar, we probably could have gone in a little more detail to more tips, but I think this is good for today. We've summarized it into 5 general concepts. So again, if you have any questions about these as I'm going through, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat box. But for those that just joined, we are recording this, so we'll send it out to you later as a link. So optimizing flow of information, color, space-saving tips, legends or keys, so when to or when not to use them. I'll actually do a demo of how to use it or make one properly, and then putting it all into context. All right, so first thing, optimizing flow of information. We try to repeat this at every webinar just so that it stays top of mind, but it's really worth repeating that it's important to follow, generally speaking, one of these 8 compositions. And it kind of creates a really simple shape. It's unidirectional from left to right, up to down. So those are the 2 first boxes. You can select sort of a cyclical formation as well. Z shape is very common, as you saw in a previous slide, for flow diagrams or protocols. I'm going to skip down to the fork shape because I think that's usually one of the most common compositions I see for grants is this kind of fork in the road. Maybe you have one experiment or one endeavor to come out with two specific aims, um, or depending on the number of prongs on the fork, you can have different numbers of outcomes. Just make sure that you're, again, going left to right, up to down with your flow of information, and try not to combine a bunch of these compositions into one composition. That's when the reviewer's eye starts to wander around and the quote unquote getting lost path. You don't want them to get lost in your image. And here's an image that we like to use as an example. Someone bravely volunteered this figure that they were kind of struggling to make into kind of a coherent flow. I think all of the elements were there. All we had to do was kind of rearrange the elements to be a little more aligned and consistent. So what we did was we took this kind of strange composition and rearranged it to be a little bit more in a Z-shaped formation, if you can see that. So left to right, 1 to 4, and then zipping back to the beginning here to say 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, so very, very simple kind of change of composition really helps to clean up the legibility of the story. So hopefully you see that there. Also, we're big fans of numbering steps. So I'll show you how to do that really fast in BioRender. We have pre-numbered steps you can use, but just keep that in mind that I think it's really important to keep things consistent. Another thing I'll highlight here is in the previous, not every step had a picture associated. For example, the one down here, usually positive day 8 to 14. So what I did was I just tried to make sure that each step had a picture and a word associated, just to, again, keep it uniform if you can. All right, and then really quick review of the idea of the principle of proximity. So it sounds like jargon, and basically what it is to make sure that each step is kind of closely knit to that step itself, so that you could potentially rearrange the steps to be linear, cyclical, fork shaped, what have you, as long as it's kind of chunked together closely. So you've heard us talk about this before again, but ensuring that they all almost feel like they're on their own post-it, so that when you rearrange those elements, it becomes really easy to switch from, say, linear or Z-shape to cyclical. A lot of design ends up being shifting things around just to see what fits, depending on the shape or dimensions of your canvas. So having them in discrete little boxes like this really helps to quickly rearrange your composition. And then just driving the sort of principle of proximity a little bit further. I see this kind of image a lot in publications, I'd say, but definitely, you'd see these in grant images. Something about this isn't following the principle of proximity, and if you can't quite put your finger on why something looks crowded, what we recommend is drawing a box around each step, and then really simply rearranging those boxes so that they're a little more aligned, a little more consistently spaced out. This does so much to your figure. It really does boost the clarity. And it's such a simple tip, and again, worth repeating every time we get together here, because it is a common mistake we see. So, I won't belabor the point too much, but just to say that each step should have enough of a buffer in between each. Okay. Here's another example. I took the left image and kind of arranged it a little bit more tightly within each step. So that kind of principle of proximity again. Also following the rule of hierarchy of text. So library preparation, DNA library bridge amplification, those sentences or subtitles deserved its own hierarchy or boldness or size of text, as you can see here. We space things out a little bit more to be a nice quadrant. And then, of course, sort of the bread and butter of protocols is really numbering each step very clearly. Great. So that's purely just about optimization of flow. Moving on to the color. This is something we could probably talk about all day. And again, really, really important to keep in mind as far as communicating a concept really quickly within the few minutes that you have for your grant reviewer to look at the figure, really understand it, and want to continue reading. So if you attended a previous webinar before, you'll know that we love to talk about sort of the dimensions of color. And it does sound a little jargony again. This is kind of design lingo, but suffice it to say that the 3 dimensions is their color, basically. So the name of the color is hue. So orange is a hue, red is a hue, purple is a hue. That's kind of like the first dimension there, easy. Value is the next dimension. So thinking about the lightness or darkness of a color. So if you pick red, you know, dark, dark red to light, light red, basically just mixing, if you think of it like paint, mixing black or white with red to see, you know, how dark or light you can get it is the value. And then chroma is a different dimension if you think of it on a sort of XYZ axis. It's kind of the amount of pigment or the strength of that color. So a really, really bright red versus a really kind of pastel red is how you can kind of think about it. So keep those 3 dimensions in mind as we go through the next examples. I wanted to bring this in because I kind of want any opportunity to talk about this artist, Richard Schmid, who's one of my favorite oil painters. But basically, I'm bringing it in because I think a lot of the principles we use in fine art and design has a huge implication in science communication. And the reason is our eyes are attracted to the same thing, you know, across the board, whether you're looking at a painting or a science figure. Basically, our eyes are looking for the brightest, so the most saturated, the highest contrast image you can find. So obviously for this painting, it's kind of the 3 flowers here that make up this triad of composition. And you know that in BioRender, we like to throw things into black and white just to see if that stands up, and it still does. You can see those 3 flowers quite brightly there. So when you think about this and maybe apply it to something like a protein pathway, just know that the areas that you highlight as the brightest color and the most contrast is going to jump out at your viewer the strongest. So this might seem a little abstract, but I'll tie it all together in the next slide here. So looking at this pathway, I chose this. This was generously donated by Dr. Daisy Shu from Harvard. And they created this template, and I loved it because the TGF-beta, that kind of cluster of proteins up here and molecules, is really the most saturated, the highest contrast, and I would say the brightest. And that's where my eye goes first. Also, naturally, everything is going to be read top to down, just by nature of, you know, the fall of gravity. But take this exact composition and now move the kind of flower to a different part of the composition, and immediately your eye is going to go to that section of the picture. It might start at the top, but I bet many of you on the Zoom call now actually went down to the nucleus area around the DNA, just because that's now where the brightest color is, the highest contrast. So kind of like bees to a flower, you know, our eyes are going to look for that strongest area of contrast and saturation. So keep that in mind. It's a really powerful tool if you think about it, how you can control where your grant reviewer is going to land their eye first. And also draws emphasis to the area that you feel is the most important. If that's your area or your area of research, you know, that's important to keep in mind. So I'm just going to jump out here into BioRender to show an example here how I would further emphasize another area. Again, if you're new to BioRender, this might be a little disorienting, but this is the gallery view. Hopefully you can still see my screen. And I'm going to open up that same figure that I had ready. So here we go. Here's that image. And let's see, I'm going to select an area maybe over here. Now these are kind of pill-shaped proteins that are made with our dynamic shapes. So that means you can change it to whatever color you like under the sun. In this case, we have these sort of preset color palettes, but you can actually, pick any color under the rainbow. Just be aware that if you do this, you're kind of going into non-design approved territory because it's an unlimited palette. So now the text is a little bit illegible. We'll have to make the text itself over here. The text itself maybe white so that it really stands out. If you see that difference. Again, contrast is your best friend here, especially if you want to satisfy your colorblind audiences. I'm going to go back to our preset color just because I think they're a little more softer of a palette, but still striking enough that you will get people's attention. So you can see here again, highest contrast, almost darkest, most saturated area. There we go. And I'm going to download this onto my desktop and click export. And I'm going to move back to my slide deck. There we go. So you can see here 3 of the exact same image with emphasis on different parts of the pathway communicate almost a completely different concept, or at least draw your attention to a completely different area. So hopefully you can take this trick with you to other types of figure drawing, not just pathways, protocols, maybe cell-to-cell interactions. Really powerful tool, I think, to keep in your tool belt. So the 3 things are, again, the color itself, the brighter, the stronger, saturation, and color value, which is the lightness or darkness of a color. Great. And then back to the idea of poor contrast, of course, you want to make sure that your images have a high enough contrast so that even if the grant reviewer, for some reason, prints your application on an inkjet printer in black and white, or if you happen to have a colorblind reviewer, or not just for grants, but in general, your audience, that they'll be able to see it. So at BioRender, you know that we love to talk about converting images to grayscale so that you can really see if there's enough contrast in your image by eliminating color as a variable. So you can see here that the DNA almost completely disappeared in the converted to grayscale version. The signaling symbol inside the nucleus is almost obliterated, and the apoptosis label also almost illegible. So just keep that in mind as a really nice, quick gut check way to see if you have enough contrast in your image. And here it is. All I did was reduce the opacity of the background elements. So if the cancer cell was shown at 100% opacity, I just slid it down to about 80%. And so it lightened the color essentially of that cell. And then I boosted the color of the DNA here. So instead of this kind of orangey color on blue, which is really hard to see, I chose a very dark color on top of a very light nucleus backdrop. So this seems like a very obvious tip, but again, it's something that we see very commonly done poorly. So just wanted to make sure that we repeated this and that you keep this in mind when you're making figures. And imagine now shrinking this down to something very small, like for an NIH specific aims page. You're going to want to make sure your image has a high enough contrast. The convert to grayscale option is a really easy button within BioRender. Actually, maybe I'll just step out real quick and show you. So if I go back to this figure, over on the right-hand panel here, it says View Canvas in Grayscale, this little kind of half moon logo. If I click that, you see that we see everything in black and white. And so if I had picked a font color that was maybe black, you can see totally disappears. Even though in the color world, I can kind of read it, but even that is pretty bad. So turning it to black and white is just a nice way to make it super apparent that you don't have enough contrast in your figure. Great. And this way, even if you are fully, able to see or you're colorblind, it kind of evens out the playing field here. All right, back to the slide deck. All right, so tip 3, 4, and 5, we'll do a little bit more in-app as far as, practical tips, but how I like to think of it is, I don't know how large all of your apartments are, but many of us are in smaller apartments where maybe you have to optimize every square inch, and that's kind of how it feels when you're making a grant figure. So a lot of the space saving tips will hopefully help with that, keeping things tidy. A lot of the times it ends up just being aligning things better and really optimizing the use of negative space in between rows and columns. We love to use the analogy of Pac-Man again. So between rows and columns, between images and their title and subtitles, try to keep a relatively consistent padding between everything. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you pick a unit like 0.5 centimeter and just follow that across the entire image, that's generally good enough. And I'll show you how to use grid lines in the app itself. And another really quick kind of gut check here again. This is a little bit more for a publication, but I thought it was worth repeating right now, is if you have a multi-panel figure, and again, you feel like something's not quite right with it or it feels crowded, go ahead and use this kind of box trick where you box in the rows and columns or each step, and then rearrange the boxes so it's a little cleaner, just like tidying up a room, and then, throwing those numbers or letters back on. So I know, again, this is pretty obvious, but this little box trick really has helped even our internal team in designing protocols and multi-panel figures. Just keeps things aligned. And you can do it at the very end as well. You don't have to think about this all throughout. You can throw down all of your panels and at the very end, just kind of nudge it in place. Great. Another idea of kind of saving space here is kind of color picking the font to something that it's labeling. And you've probably seen us talk about this before, but it really eliminates the need to use arrows. Of course, you have to be careful because, again, if you have a colorblind audience, they might not be able to identify what color matches what label. We do also recommend that you use proper lines when you're labeling versus, of course, the action arrows or the movement arrows. So I wouldn't mix up these proteins moving in space with the labels you would use to label something. In BioRender, we actually have a line with a little dot at the end, and that's actually the perfect line to use to label things. And I'll go through that as well, but just keep that in mind. Try not to use the pointy-headed arrow for everything in your whole figure if you're actually communicating different concepts with that same arrow. Otherwise, it's going to look like disintegrating microtubule is entering this shape when really you're trying to just label that thing. I hope that's clear. Makes sense. And then kind of the tried, tested, and true way of saving space here is to remove lines completely and then just, stick the word right on top of the object. Usually with like a little box behind it at like 50% opacity is pretty good if it's something textured like this. So you can try that out as well. Again, contrast is the biggest thing here when you're layering objects. So just make sure that you have enough difference, or the delta between the background and the foreground elements is high enough. And then finally, for space saving tips, we love using circle crop in the design world just to kind of zoom into things. So we do have a circle crop option in BioRender when you're cropping things. And then what I usually do is just throw on a circle and then kind of show these little faded lines to make it look like we're zooming into that area. Really great way to save space. Instead of, blowing up those two neurons super, super large and then taking up more space than you need. Okay, so keys, legends, to use or not to use. I'm just going to go through this really quick so that I can get to the demo part. But the problem usually that we see with keys or legends is that a lot of the elements end up looking very similar. So you've probably seen images like this where some of the icons, I guess, or symbols used start to look very similar. And so you're constantly looking back and forth. We call it kind of dipping your ink or dipping your pen into the ink, of like moving your eye back and forth, back and forth. And then by then you're kind of exhausted and you've lost your viewer. So make sure that the symbols you use are different enough. In this case, the immature lysosome and the late endocytic plus immature lysosome, late endosome plus immature lysosome combo looks kind of similar, that pink with yellow, especially in the main image here. So just be careful of that. A couple of other examples here where I think the number of items in the legend also starts to get a little bit intimidating to be able to understand. And actually, the order in which you show the elements in your key or legend also becomes an important part of the story. So again, I'll go through it more in practice, but just wanted to show you a couple of images here where I would have probably made sure that the symbols were different enough. There was enough contrast, which I think we're maybe lacking in some of these. And then also the actual symbols of choice. This is an extreme example where I think it's successful, but usually we can't get to this level. Images with glycans where they're actual symbols with different colors. So if you could get this level, great, but usually we can't abstract it to this level of simplicity. But this is definitely the sort of ideal, I guess, if you're looking at using a legend or a key. This is the image that I'm going to kind of remodel for you and kind of see how we can improve this figure to be a little more concise and easier to view. Now, your research might not have anything to do with neuroscience or mice models or cells in general, but the principles I'm going to go through right now are definitely going to apply across many types of figures. So what I'm going to do is head over back to BioRender, and I'm going to actually sign out just so that for those brand new to BioRender can kind of see what that process looks like. So basically what it is a super easy landing page here. It's going to look a little different for you if you're using the TAMU login portal. All you need is a Chrome browser. We recommend Chrome, and a steady internet connection. Okay, so I'm going to go down here to my TAMU grants folder, open up this figure. All right, so many of you have probably been here before where you've got your figure made, everything's looking nice, but you still feel like something's a little bit crowded. And by the way, this was also generously created by Dr. Matthew Swire. His version was way better than this. I admittedly just mucked it up a little bit to show you how I would change something that maybe I've seen before. So this was no fault of his. His final version, available as a template actually in BioRender, is beautiful. So definitely check it out. So first things first, what I would do is start to eliminate some of these labels, of course. If I didn't have a legend here, I think this is a good candidate. This image is a good candidate to put a legend in. Again, especially for a grant figure where you probably have limited space. So I would introduce a legend in this case. So right away, of course, we can start to remove some of these elements, these labels. So already we're kind of removing words, we're removing labels. I think that's looking all right. Maybe even this one down here. Okay, so already it's kind of, cleaning up here a little bit. You'll also notice that the type of arrow being used to label is the right one. So this little line with a dot at the end, that's the right one to be using. Otherwise, it would just look strange if, let's see, up here, if I use the pointy arrow like so. Sometimes it can compete. In this case, it actually doesn't look that bad, but you'll notice a very stark difference when you start to get lots of labels involved. So we'll just stick with the one with the dot at the end. Another thing I would say to do is look at the, I guess thinking back to that painting of a flower, think about where the focus is and try to eliminate, and this might be counterintuitive, but try to eliminate the number of colors in your diagram. So in this case, I think the new oligodendrocytes really don't have to be purple. There's a lot of colors happening here, almost too many, I guess, flowers. So I'm going to maybe select something that's like a dark green. So it's different enough from this element here, which is the existing oligodendrocyte. But really that difference isn't too important. And then if I want, maybe I'll just take these existing oligodendrocyte cells and pick a color that's, I guess the green was all right. If I do want to make it, a little more obvious that it's different, I can, use the opacity slider to adjust the color even more, but still staying within that sort of green family. All right, so that's already cleaning stuff up a little bit. What I'd also like to do is maybe differentiate between the engaged neuron and the neuron that's not engaged. So maybe I'll make this one gray. It almost looks deactivated in a way. And that's a trick we also use, is using gray to show kind of a inactivation. And this also is something that might not seem obvious, but the order in which you show, if you do use a legend, the order in which these kind of characters show up should be in order in which they appear in the composition. So kind of like a movie where the credits show in order of, I guess, appearance, in order of appearance in the movie. That's how I would also show the legend. Now, this is a small detail, but I think it just keeps things nice and organized. So in this case, I think the cortical neuron shows up first, and then this character here. Sometimes I'll break the rule and show two similar icons side by side, just so that people can see that differentiation. There we go. That's looking a little better. Cool. Okay, so let's hit preview here just to see what we've got. Looks a little better. And we still have a lot of colors happening. I'm trying to see what else I can tone down. Maybe these orange cells here, the oligodendrocyte progenitor cells, can also be subdued. Now, luckily, kind of like the glycans, it actually has its own shape. So because it had its own shape, you can kind of get away with using almost the same color as something else. So we could use this color. So that's already looking a little better. My eye now goes right to this bright red engaged and disengaged neuron, because that's what my eye is seeing as what changes from panel to panel. So you kind of want to show, those games where it's like, what's the difference between these two images? You want that to be very obvious and not buried. If you're actually making a comparison of A to B, if there's too many things going on, it's going to be like a Where's Waldo of, okay, what actually changed between these two figures? So just keep that in mind. Now that I've kind of uniformed the, I guess, background or supporting characters, the main characters now can shine. In fact, now I'm looking at it further, the traveling action potential here is actually really standing out to me. And so that story is coming across much cleaner. So let's go ahead and export this and see how that looks in our slide deck. Okay, head on over here, insert the image. And this is the same if you're using PowerPoint. So just, uploading the image after you've downloaded it. And you can see here the difference. So the before and the after, much cleaner. I think there was a lot going on in the previous, and it kind of subdues now in the after. So the changes can be a little subtle, but imagine now taking this and bringing it into something as dense as this body of text. You can see that it shrinks down quite nicely. Now I've had it pre-shrunk here, but having not had those labels removed, it would be quite difficult to be able to make out the difference in a lot of these panels. So that's my fifth tip to you here, is putting it all into context. And sometimes I equate it to this like really hilarious thing that has been happening on the web recently, and that's when people accidentally order like miniature versions of things. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, so I hope I don't lose you, but basically what you want to think about is if your image has to be shrunk down to like a 3-inch by 2-inch image, then naturally you're going to have to let things go, let some details fall off, maybe delete a bunch of things, because that's not going to matter at the miniature size. Basically, you need to think about what are the main things that I have to include in my figure and what not to include. Because again, at a small scale, it doesn't matter that you have every single tiny little thing included. The main message is really what's important. So I think that's pretty clear here, even in a teeny tiny scale. You can actually test it out just by grabbing some fake layouts and then sticking in your image inside that layout and see how it reads. And if it can read well, then you've done a good job. But I wouldn't wait till the last minute to squeeze your image into your grant composition and seeing if it's legible, because then you'll have to go back and do a bunch of changes. So try to do it as you're illustrating, as part of the process. Okay. And I'm going back to BioRender here to see if we have time for one more quick demo. I think we've got a couple minutes here. I wanted to kind of play on that topic of space saving, because we didn't go into too much detail about that. But, as I said, we love using the concept of circle crops. So if you come up with images like this, where you have to zoom into an area and show details of something, again, we do recommend using the kind of circle crop option. So I'm going to do a little bit of a live demo right now, maybe using the cell cluster. So what I did here, for those that are brand new to BioRender, I've got a big library of icons, and all I did was type in a keyword like cell, and I'm going to pull this out. And it's got a purple box around it, which is telling me if I double click, I can actually expand these things a little further. I'm going to undo a couple of these things. And let's see, maybe I'll, have a zoom in of the cells here. And I want to select, this is getting complicated because there's these icons that are clusters and icons that are single. If I want to find out everywhere on my canvas where there's the same icon, so if you have a spray of cytokines or antibodies, you can use this select same icon option. And there you go. I've selected all the same icon, and I can mass color change as I need. So really handy tool. I'm going to use that, select these little guys, and change those colors. There we go. And then I'm going to circle crop this. So I'm going to go up here and click circle crop. And I don't want to show all of this. I just kind of want to show a zoom in. There we go. And maybe what I also want is to do that fancy little zoom in panel. So I'm going to type in zoom. Oh, I'm stuck on templates. I'm gonna toggle over here to the icons. There's templates and icons. I'm gonna go with icons. And this one looks kind of nice. Just gonna angle it the way I need. And I'm gonna zoom in a little bit just so you can see here. There we go. And you'll notice that you can use this tip, of course, not just for grant figures, but for any kind of figure making. And maybe if I want to shorten these, I can do that too. But basically, the beauty of this is that you can see I can really move this anywhere on the canvas. So if I'm restricted by size or by real estate of my canvas, the fact that it's in a circle crop gives me a lot of flexibility and power as far as where I want to put this. And it still looks good. It's very forgiving as to where you want to place it. There we go. I just grouped that so it kind of stays together in one piece. And let's see, if I move over here, it says stained cells appear brown under the microscope. Okay, so maybe I want to show that some of the clusters here happen to be brown. So I'm gonna maybe stretch out the arms from which they're coming out from a little bit closer. And I'm gonna double click into this little area. Maybe select a couple of areas here to be brown. There we go. So really nice way to keep your composition clean and tidy, but also saving space. You don't want to, in this case, you didn't want to have to zoom in this object with the dish and everything. See how much space that takes up? You can avoid that by still showing the plate and giving some context, but then zooming in on just certain areas so that you can see a little closer. And of course, our favorite little tip is numbering your steps. So under Insert Shape here, we've got this nice drop down of pre-made, I guess, proteins and numbers and text boxes. It's a little tucked away here. So again, go up to your bar and click Insert Shape. Go to Insert Text Shape. And then I like 1, 2, 3. If you use ABC, that's fine too. And all I do is click down on my mouse and I get a perfect circle with a number in it. And now if I Alt drag, I can, of course, make multiple stamps of that. And then I'll double click to change that number. And if you're a stickler and you want to use our fancy grid line option, we do have these grid lines you can place down like so. And again, what this does is just kind of gives you an idea of evenness of your spacing of your object. So maybe I'd have to tuck this in a little bit just to follow that rule. Maybe I'll move this over just a nudge so that's in line with the number 1. And you don't have to follow it too strictly, but it just gives you a nice rough idea that everything is evenly spaced out. Okay. And I hit preview. Let's see how that looks. Looking pretty nice. And maybe I'll export that and throw it into my slide deck. Great. We do have a lot of really cool new features like the brushes category. If you did notice, this thing kept popping up, which is the sort of slide feature. It's brand new to BioRender, so we're only releasing it very, very slowly in a beta version. If you're interested in testing it out, you can email Francesca and she can kind of unlock that feature for you. But for now, we're kind of releasing it on a limited beta version. But it kind of offers a nice way to just present mode from BioRender if you don't want to kind of go back and forth between PowerPoint and BioRender. There we go. Super clean, nice and arranged. And this is actually available as a template in BioRender if this happens to be something of interest to you topic-wise. But for those brand new to BioRender, I keep talking about the templates. That's this category up here. And we add new templates every day. So every time you come back, we're going to have a different set of templates. If I type in neuroscience, we're going to have a nice arrangement of neuroscience templates. So definitely come back and search what you might need, and hopefully we'll have it. Immunology. These are all fully editable and ready to use. You can take bits and pieces of a template, put it into another. Again, fully editable. All right, so we covered a lot in the last, I'd say 50 minutes. Again, I think I'll pause there to see if there are any questions remaining. Looks like maybe Francesca and Cindy have answered all your questions along the way. And again, we will have this recording ready for everybody once this Zoom webinar compresses, the video compresses. Here's that link again if you want access to it. And a big thank you to, again, Alex Trott, who is the Associate Director of Rodent Preclinical Phenotyping Core, for helping us organize today's session, and of course, bringing BioRender and many really awesome tools to you and your team there at TAMU. Excellent. Okay, well, I guess I'll pause there. If there aren't any other questions, I guess we can sign off, but wanted to say thank you so much for your continued enthusiasm. I'd say TAMU is one of the most enthusiastic for scientific communication endeavors. So I definitely see that in a lot of the really great research and science that comes out of your school. Definitely a different energy there. So really appreciate your enthusiasm in attending these webinars, for the great questions, and hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Great. Thank you for sticking around, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.